Okay, so obviously I'm reading a lot this year, which is a very good thing. Um, Today I just wanted to talk about a book that is definitely relevant to the season. It's a book that I just happened across at Barnes& and Noble, as I do, and it's called A Wild Winter Swan. The cover captivated me, by the way, like the beautiful illustration by Scott McCowan, and the book is of course by Gregory Maguire, who is most famous for writing the book Wicked, which was the basis for, of course, the smash hit Broadway show. I'm not gonna lie, this was my first delve into his material, and I've had Wicked on my to read list for a really long time. A Wild Winter Swan is based on a fairy tale, a famous fairy tale called The Wild Swans. I don't know how famous it is actually. The Wild Swans is a Hans Christian Andersen classic. Well, there's 11 brothers, I believe, and one sister, so 12 siblings, and it's like the typical father remarries evil stepmother sort of situation, where the stepmother turns the brothers into swans because she's evil and wants to put a curse on them. And so their sister goes on a quest to find a way to turn them back into humans. Every night at midnight, they turn back into humans, in the same vein, sort of as Swan Lake, aka the Swan Princess. But she learns from the sister. She learns this magic from the fairies of how to sew magical shirts that, when put on, it will transform her brothers back into humans permanently. But it takes her all year to do that, to make the shirts, to sew them out of magical thread or whatever. And by the time she gets to the last one, she runs out of time and doesn't have enough time to sew the last sleeve onto the final shirt. So she turns the rest of her brothers back into full humans by putting those shirts on them at the stroke of midnight. And but the final brother, she throws a shirt on him that only has one sleeve, and so he turns into a human, but he still has one swan wing left. Hence, he is the sort of the mythos, the basis for the character in this book that I'll introduce you to in a second. This book is actually a coming of age story. It's in the magical realist genre, magical realism, which is one of my personal favorite genres in literature. So this is actually a story about a girl named Laura, and she lives in New York City, where a lot of magical realism happens apparently, because another one of my favorite magical realism style books, Winter's Tale, which I should do a review of because I love that book. That also takes place in a mythical New York City. This is kind of just ordinary New York City. She lives in a brownstone house with her grandparents, who are two Italian immigrants, recently first generation Italians who came to New York City. This novel takes place in the 60s, I believe, the early 60s. So they built up a whole reputation, and a grocery business, or restaurant grocery business sort of thing, from scratch in the midst of the Great Depression and World War II and everything. So she lives with those grandparents because her father died in the war, her brother died in the war, her mother had a mental breakdown and was sent away. So Laura has no choice but to live with her father's parents, her grandparents, who live in New York City, and so she's living in this house. They're kind of typical Italian grandparents. They love to cook. They're a little bit fussy about everything, about the details. They have a reputation to protect, but they're loving and kind and caring and a little bit overbearing in those regards. But they genuinely care for Laura. Their names are the Ciardi's, by the way. That's their family name. But Laura calls them Nonno and Nonna, which I guess is Italian for grandmom and grandpop or whatever. They also have a maid, an Irish maid named Mary Bernice, who's sort of chummy with Laura, but also sort of a surrogate parent to her. And so Laura's kind of caught up in the lives of all these fussy adults around her, and she's expected to behave like a proper young lady, which she doesn't, as is characteristic of the child protagonists of these stories. She's not really a child, I guess she's a teenager, but the young protagonists in these fairy tale stories are often rebellious. Laura is certainly that. She gets expelled from her school, a private Catholic school, for getting into a fight with another student. So she's going to be sent away to like I guess like a boarding school in Canada, in Montreal. And so she's really not happy about that. Despite everything, she wants to stay in New York City with her grandparents. She wants her mother to come back, but every sign points to that's not going to happen anytime soon. And so she's kind of in a rut. She's like a tutor for like the first graders. She just has trouble getting along with like the kids her own age. But how does like the story of the wild swans factor into this? Well, one night on Christmas Eve, of course, a swan boy flies into her window. And it's kind of, it takes a while for the novel to build up to that. Like, I don't think he appears until like 50 pages in, which is kind of cool because I like a good build up and like, you know, building anticipation. It sets up Laura's life in the city with her family very well before it gets to like the fantasy stuff. There isn't really that much fantasy stuff either. It's just a boy who she finds on like the roof outside of her room, and he's injured and cold, and he's like a normal boy except he's not. He has one swan wing, and I believe it's his left arm actually. So swan wing, and then she tries to take care of him. She tries to hide him from her family as they're going crazy, like trying to get all the food ready for Christmas Eve dinner. And so it's kind of like a fish out of water sort of situation where like hilarity ensues. Oh my gosh, the mishaps of hiding this creature. The boy is sort of human. He can speak. He speaks a little bit of, I believe, Danish, which makes sense with like, you know, where most of these fairy tales are set. And but he's also very animalistic. Like he's a swan. He makes like swan and animal noises. He eats raw animals. Without going into any spoilers, there are situations where, you know, raw meat is brought before him and he just devours it. And you know, he kind of has like a temper too. Like he reacts to things in sort of like feral way. Which is interesting. I like that he's not just some kind of mystical fairy creature who's like friendly, and he there's not much conversation between him and Laura. Like most of their interaction is kind of like instinctual, I guess you would say. But there's not much else to this book, which is, I know it doesn't sound like a good thing, but it is, because most of the book just is in that house as the family is getting ready and the repairmen are coming in, and Laura is sort of like getting along with the working class repairmen when she's not supposed to. She's sort of like flirting with the one younger guy who's one of the repairmen. Stuff like that goes on, and that's kind of where the heart of this novel lies, in like the realistic characters. And then you have like this swan boy who's just there and adding this sort of weight to like Laura's internal struggle, which is he's sort of like a metaphorical, like outside representation of the, you know, imagination and frustration that's going on in her head the whole time. This whole situation and how she cares for the swan boy, his name is Hans, of course, leads her to certain realizations about herself and her life. Aside from the plot and like what happens, the essence of a magical realist book like this is usually the writing style, which is really what gripped me throughout this book. It's very poetic. Gregory Maguire is a master of his work and of the art of literature, and it shows in this book because he writes in a poetic style, as I said, sort of stream of consciousness. It's in the third person. It's narrated in the third person, but it's definitely from Laura's point of view. And as she's going about her business in the story, and you're following like over her shoulder, sort of, you are getting her stream of consciousness just in the regular text, but there's also like this counterpoint narrative of like her narrating her own story in her head as though she were writing it down. I think at some point she actually is sitting there like writing, like physically, like sort of like it's a journal, but sort of like she's practicing like writing an autobiography, and she writes it in a very whimsical style, and it's in like bold letters whenever that happens. It's like situations where it switches from the regular narrative, like Laura watched the snow make feathers upon her wall, to the girl thought, doors have language too, they talk to each other. And so like she refers to herself in the third person as like the girl. So she's sort of writing her own life as though it were a fairy tale, or looking at her life as though it were a fairy tale. And it's one of those things where, like, well, nobody else in the book really ever sees the Swan Boy, or at least I'm not going to give away whether that happens ever, but for most of the book, it's like her hiding him. And she's the only one who really interacts with him. And it's like, is it all in her head? Is this something she's imagining? Because it's having real effects on things going on in the house. So is she like projecting her imagination into real life, and she the one really causing things to happen, or is she actually like attuned to a real fairy tale that's come to life? Um, and I like that it's left open, up in the air, as you might say, and vague, up for interpretation. You know, this is the kind of book. This kind of book should be that way. But I wasn't sure about the chemistry between her and the boy due to the fact that he is a part animal and he's not fully human, and they can't really have this fully human relationship, and that the relationship is based on instinct and a little bit of like base attraction, and physical attraction, but like not much beyond that. This very like sort of juvenile understanding of each other. I wasn't sure if I really could get into what the novel was pushing. Like, is this novel being pushed as like this fantastic romance in the same vein as something as like The Shape of Water or something, the film? Which, now that I'm thinking about it, this book does actually remind me of like a Guillermo del Toro story, like The Shape of Water or Pan's Labyrinth, that coming of age sort of dark fairy tale thing. But don't go into it expecting like a deep love story, because you're not going to get that, and that's not what it's supposed to be. Yeah, like as I said, the cover art is beautiful, and if you remove the jacket, you get a beautiful illustration of Hans falling through the New York sky. I know the camera viewfinder is being reflected on the shiny, glossy cover, but there's the New York skyline. It's a really beautiful art on this book, and I know I'm not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but it did attract me when I saw it. I was like, Wild Winter Swan, I love swans. I wrote my thesis about a sort of like a swan character, and it had the name Swan in the title, so I was like, oh wow, I'm gonna be all about this, and I wasn't disappointed. I'm really glad I picked up this book. It's a pretty quick read. I read it in like only a few days. It's just over 200 pages. The pages, by the way, are like perforated or jagged, like in that kind of like artsy paper style that they do with some hardcover books sometimes, and paperback sometimes. But I like that. I don't know. I'm a sucker for that sort of aesthetic. But anyway, yeah, I recommend it. Go check it out if you're into that sort of thing. Hopefully, I'll do a review of Winter's Tale too, or at least the movie, or a comparison between the book and the movie. I want to see a movie of this. I want to see Guillermo del Toro direct a film version of this, because I think it would be a perfect match. It is quite snowy outside right now, and I don't know if a swan person is going to fly into my window, but that would be kind of cool. I would dig that. Yeah. You never know. I forgot to mention that they mention Peter, Paul, and Mary quite a few times in this book when they're listening to like records that are new at the time, and I thought that was awesome because I'm a huge fan of Peter, Paul, and Mary, especially the song 500 Miles, which is featured in this book.